Welcome to another video Drasha. This week's Parsha is Vayechi. And with this portion, we reach the conclusion of the book of Genesis and the conclusion of the story of Joseph and of Jacob. I want to focus on just one small piece of this week's Parsha, and that is that Jacob, who is on his deathbed, tells Joseph to bring his two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, and he blesses them. And when Jacob blesses Ephraim and Manasseh, he says, "Thus shall Israel invoke blessing in the future, saying, may God make you like Ephraim and Manasseh." And indeed, that is how we bless our sons at the Shabbos table on Friday evenings. We say, Yesimcha Elokim ke'Ephraim v'cheManasseh. May God make you like Ephraim and Manasseh. I'm sure that all of us who have said this blessing on a Friday evening have probably at some point wondered, why Ephraim and Manasseh? Why don't we say, may God make you like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? After all, when we bless our daughters, we say, may God make you like Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah, which makes perfect sense. After all, we bless our daughters hoping that they'll become like the matriarchs of the Jewish people. So why Ephraim and Manasseh? So just like everything else in Judaism, there, of course, are many possible explanations, and commentators have indeed offered many answers. But I'm going to focus on two answers that tie into the themes that I have been talking about in relation to the Joseph story. So the first is, as we have spoken about, is sibling rivalry. And we saw that the book of Genesis has as a recurring theme the rivalry between brothers, and even the rivalry between sisters, as we mentioned, between Rachel and Leah. But the first murder was of one brother by another. That was Cain, who murdered his brother Abel. And then in every generation of the patriarchs, we have instances of sibling rivalry, Isaac and Ishmael, Jacob and Esau, and then finally Joseph and his brothers. And we saw in last week's Torah portion that in this last instance of sibling rivalry, there is a certain resolution, there is a certain reconciliation that takes place between Joseph and his brothers. But Ephraim and Manasseh, I think, are perhaps the models that we use to bless our sons precisely because they are the first brothers who are mentioned in the Torah where there is no strife, there is no sibling rivalry that the Torah mentions. And therefore, I think that when we say, may God make you like Ephraim and Manasseh, we're really hoping, of course, that our children will be at peace with their siblings, but much more deeply than that, we are really hoping that the Jewish people will live in unity, in achdus, as we say in Hebrew, that unfortunately the Jewish people over the centuries have seen too much strife and divisiveness. You know, the rabbis say that the Second Temple was destroyed because of sinat chinam, because of baseless hatred of one Jew for another. Throughout Jewish history, there have been various Jewish groups that very often have actually, not have had very bad relations between each other. And even in our contemporary Jewish life, we know that there is a lot of divisiveness. And so our hope when we say, may God make you like Ephraim and Manasseh, is that the Jewish people should live in peace and in harmony. They should be like these two brothers who did not strive with one another. The other answer that ties into a theme is the fact that Ephraim and Manasseh were born in Egypt and were raised in Egypt. They are really the first children of the diaspora. Now, the fact is that except for Benjamin, all of Jacob's sons were born outside of Israel. But, of course, at some point, Jacob did come back to the land of Canaan, and all of his sons came with him, and they were living in the land of Israel. Whereas Ephraim and Manasseh, they were born and lived their lives in Egypt. They were indeed diaspora Jews. And I've mentioned the fact that I think that the reason that so much of the book of Genesis is devoted to the story of Joseph is precisely because of this issue. It really is a striking thing that the last 4 Torah portions in the book of Genesis tell the story of Joseph. Why is there such an attention to the life of Joseph? And I've always believed that the reason is, again, because Joseph is the model of a diaspora Jew. He was taken to Egypt as a teenager, and he spent his entire life there. And of course, in the case of Joseph, he became extremely successful and powerful in Egypt. And yet he remained a Jew, not only a Jew, but a faithful and pious Jew. That's why we call Joseph HaTzadik, Joseph the Tzaddik. Why is he a Tzaddik? Why don't we call someone else, why don't we call Judah the Tzaddik? No, it's Joseph the Tzaddik precisely because he lived outside of Israel. He lived in a non-Jewish environment his entire life, and yet he remained a righteous Jew. And so I think that that's why there is such an emphasis placed on the Joseph story. After all, for many generations, Jews have lived in the diaspora. But, we should also note that even when there was an independent Jewish kingdom in the land of Israel, and even when the temple was still standing in Jerusalem, there was a large diaspora community. Jews have been living in diaspora for a very long time, even preceding the destruction of Jerusalem and the exile. We know that, for instance, in the city of Alexandria in Egypt, during the Roman period, Alexandria had a very large Jewish population. As a matter of fact, some estimate that perhaps as much as a third of the population of the city of Alexandria were Jews. There were Jews living all over the Greek-speaking world. There was a Jewish community in Rome. And of course, there was a Jewish community in Babylonia. And so Jews have been living in diaspora even before the exile began. And of course, since then, we have lived scattered all over the world, living as a small minority in countries throughout the world. And the Torah presents us with a model of a Jew who lived in a foreign country, who became very powerful and successful there. Look, Joseph obviously took on much of the culture of Egypt. That's why when his brothers got there, they couldn't even recognize him. They assumed he was an Egyptian man. By the way, another interesting case is Moses, and we'll see this in next week's Parsha. When Moses escapes Egypt after killing the Egyptian man there, and he goes to Midian, and he meets his future wife, he meets the daughter of Jethro, she tells her father, Jethro, an Egyptian man helped us. That's speaking about Moses. But the fact is, Moses must have basically looked and spoken like an Egyptian. And so the point is that Joseph, despite having lived in Egypt and become successful there, and certainly taking on many of the trappings of Egyptian culture, he remained a tzaddik. He remained a pious and a loyal Jew. And that is also then why we bless our sons by Ephraim and Manasseh, because they are models of Jewish children who are raised as a small minority in a foreign culture, and yet who remain loyal Jews. Ultimately, Ephraim and Manasseh will become part of the tribes of Israel, just as all of the sons of Jacob. So that there is no distinction to be made between Judah and Levi and Simeon and Ephraim and Manasseh. And so that tells us that that it is possible to raise children in the diaspora, and yet that they should remain faithful and pious and loyal Jews. And so I think we see these two themes really come together. One is the idea of living as a Jew in the diaspora and yet remaining Jews, and on the other hand, the idea of achdus, of unity, of living and seeing ourselves as part of one people, no matter where we live. And again, this is really, I think, the great miracle of Jewish history. And we can see it most clearly when we visit in the state of Israel, that you can see Jews there who lived in over 100 different countries, speaking different languages, having really many different cultures, depending on what part of the world they lived in. And yet, they have come together to see themselves as one people, the people of Israel, living today in the state of Israel. But we living in America also are part of Am Yisrael, the people of Israel. And so this hope, number one, for unity, and the hope that we can remain Jews no matter where we live, those, I think, are the two themes that are brought together by mentioning the names of Ephraim and Manasseh. So I want to wish everyone a good Shabbos and continue to stay safe.